In the first scene of the movie, Andre, a black man, is shown strolling by himself through a tranquil neighborhood when a suspicious-looking white automobile approaches him. He attempts to turn around out of fear but quickly discovers that the automobile door is open. But the driver quickly knocks him down and drags him inside the vehicle after appearing out of nowhere. The following scenario introduces our primary character, Chris Washington, a black photojournalist who has just finished packing up. Rose Armitage, his white girlfriend, arrives at his home and tells him she's taking him to meet her parents for the first time. Chris worries that her parents could be racist and asks Rose whether they know he is black before they leave. Rose assures him, though, that her parents are not racist. Chris contacts his closest buddy Rod, who works as an airport security guard while driving there, to express his gratitude for caring for his dog while he is on this trip. After that, Chris appears envious after hearing Rose and Rod joke about it, so Rose taunts him about it. Rose wants to say hi to Rod, so he puts Rod on speaker. But the two are startled as a leaping deer slams into their windshield. When they get out, Chris discovers a dead deer on the edge of the woods, and one of the rearview mirrors is damaged. They decided to contact the police, but as Chris was being questioned, the cops demanded to see his ID completely out of the blue. Rose reprimands the racist officer indignantly because Chris wasn't even operating the vehicle. The two continued until they eventually arrived at Rose's parents' house. Rose's parents are well off. Her mother, Missy, is a psychiatric nurse, and her father, Dean Armitage, neurosurgeon. The fact that the family's groundskeeper and housekeeper are both black annoys Chris as the father shows him around the property. Observing Chris's uneasiness, Dean informs him that the groundskeeper and housekeeper used to look after his parents, but Dean couldn't handle letting them go when they passed away. So, he decided to keep them around. The parents then revealed they would host a home party tomorrow as the four sat around the porch for a talk. Additionally, we discovered that Chris's mother passed away when he was a little child after being hit by a vehicle. The parents shifted the subject because they felt it was too delicate, and they began talking about how they had detected Chris smoking based on his demeanor. The father suggests Chris try Missy's hypnosis therapy because Dean says it works well for getting rid of that habit. While they converse, Georgina, the housekeeper, gives them tea, but there's obviously something strange about her because she displays cheerful and anxious facial expressions. Missy Ridley orders the housekeeper to leave when she notices this. But before we can see Chris's response, Rose's younger brother, Jeremy, who just got home from medical school, interrupts them. After dinner, a belligerent while the housekeeper oddly lingers in the background, Jeremy amusingly recounts a humiliating incident about Rose from high school. However, the situation becomes heated when Jeremy continues to question Chris about his fighting skills and brings up how black people's genetic composition makes them physically stronger than white people. When Jeremy stands up from his chair and prepares to challenge Chris to a duel, things turn even stranger. Fortunately, the parents intervened before things got out of hand. When Rose and the couple are finally alone in Rose's room, she goes off on an irrational rant about how strange and racist her family has been all day. She apologizes to Chris for her surprise at her family's behavior. Later that evening, Chris decides to go outside for a smoke since he has trouble falling asleep. But in a few seconds, he sees the unsettling image of the groundskeeper Walter racing directly in his direction. However, he sprints by him. When he turns around, Georgina is in the window, glancing at her image and not appearing to notice him. Later, Chris enters the house and finds Missy in the treatment room sipping tea. He chooses to join her there. Here, Missy starts questioning him about his smoking behavior and asks whether he wants to begin therapy immediately. However, she starts stirring the tea before he responds, and Chris seems bothered by the noise. She then interrogates Chris in an invasive manner about his activities after his mother passed away. Chris hesitates to respond, but the sound of the tea brewing persuades him. When Missy repeatedly brings up that specific painful experience from his history, he ultimately starts to cry and feels paralyzed. Finally, Missy says the word, sink, and he unconsciously feels like he is sinking in his own head. He reaches up urgently, but he is unable to do so. The sunken place is how Missy refers to this. His body is still immobile in the chair, but his consciousness has left it. The next thing he knows, he is reading a text message from his closest buddy, Rod, in Rose's bed and dismissing the previous night's events as a nightmare. He plugs in his device after noticing that his battery is low. He chooses to go outdoors that day to snap photographs of his surroundings, and he goes to talk to Walter, the groundskeeper, to convince Chris that his nightmare wasn't a nightmare at all. He also brings up Chris' smoking habit and inquires whether the treatment with Missy was successful last night. He also learns that the hypnosis was successful since he has lost the urge to smoke. Then, when scores of affluent white people came for the Armitage's annual gathering, the two stared from the window. Old white individuals make up most of the attendees, and when they see Chris, they start acting strange. One older man seemed intrigued to learn if Chris is good at golf since Tiger Woods is. They run into another woman, who asks Rose if Chris is more desirable in bed now that he is black. Last but not least, Chris and Rose entertained another elderly couple who made the disgusting comment that having black skin is now fashionable. So, he moves on. He searches the area for a picturesque scene to capture on camera. At this point, he chooses to approach Logan King, another black man at the party. However, he mimics Walter's speech and behavior by speaking and behaving like an elderly white man. Soon after, his strangely extremely old wife approaches him and tells him someone wants to meet him. As he excuses himself, Chris gets even more irritated by Logan's lack of understanding of how a fist bump functions. Later, Chris discovers Jim Hudson, a blind guy, at the party. Chris is familiar with Jim Hudson since he was a well-known art curator who finally went blind due to a hereditary condition. Chris goes upstairs as he feels weary of socializing during the party. Unbeknownst to him, the group abruptly stops talking, and everyone starts to glance up. Returning to Rose's room, he laments that his phone charger is disconnected even though he recalls charging it earlier. Curious, he searches the other room and discovers Georgina there, thinking that she must have disconnected his phone. When he later tells Rose about Georgina's actions, Rose doesn't think the maid had malicious intent. Chris calls Ron after some time in the room to catch him up and inform him that Rose's mother put him under hypnosis to help him stop smoking. Rod thinks this is strange and points out that white people enjoy turning people into sex slaves, but Chris reassures him that it's okay. Georgina, who also has an elderly white accent and is unacquainted with contemporary language, interrupts him at that point. Chris then tells her he feels intimidated by all the white people around him. After hearing this, she seems to want to say something, but she ultimately chooses against speaking and begins to sob. She claims the Armitage family treats her like family before bumbling off like a loon. When Chris returns downstairs, he discovers Dean conversing with a group of senior citizens. One of them asks Chris if being African American nowadays is advantageous or disadvantageous. Because Chris thinks he remembers Logan, he uses this chance to call Logan and get him to answer, surreptitiously pulling out his phone to capture a photo to show his closest buddy, Rod. The following scene shows Dean explaining to them that Logan has epilepsy, and the camera flash triggered him. Dean invites visitors to participate in a party game to lighten the mood. Rose, however, decides to take Chris for a stroll after seeing that he is being downcast. The family and visitor begin a strange auction with Chris as the prize, while they are gone. Ultimately, Jim Hudson, who is blind, was the highest bidder. They decide to leave for the city in the morning. When they return to the house, the sun sets, and the last visitors enter their vehicles to go. Chris emails his closest buddy, Rod, the photo he got of Logan alone in Rose's room. As it turns out, Rod is acquainted with Andre Hayworth, who formerly dated one of their acquaintances. Following Chris' explanation that the man appears to have changed his identity and now appears to be dating a very older woman, Rod starts to panic. Chris tells the Rose they need to leave immediately because he knows something is wrong. Rose does not object, but she must first get her suitcase. He is intrigued by the open closet when Rose leaves him alone in the room and chooses to investigate it. At this point, he finds several images of Rose and information about her past connections with many black men. There are pictures of her with Walter and Georgina, not just males. As it turns out, Chris isn't the first black man Rose has dated. Chris begs her to go downstairs so they can finish this quickly, but her brother Jeremy is blocking the entrance, and Missy is waiting in the foyer with her tea. As Dean enters the room, Chris begs Rose to locate the key after seeing the tension in the air. He describes how the white mind is great but requires a better container. Chris becomes agitated and calls for Rose to locate the keys after becoming scared. When Dean and Missy start to round him, Jeremy swings his lacrosse stick at him in jest. Amid this, Rose finally admits to him that she has been aware of her family's plans. Missy taps her teacup as Chris lunges at Jeremy's, sending him back into hypnosis. Chris is now without electricity and can only watch as his family pulls him down the cellar. When Chris wakes up, he discovers himself bound to a chair and unable to escape despite his best attempts. The following day, Rod goes to the police to report that he believes a white family is holding his friend Chris hostage. He explains to the police that they abducted black individuals to use as sex slaves, but they only mock him. Chris awakens in the basement to discover John Hudson, who is blind, on the television. He calmly informs Chris that a process will entail the transplantation of his brain into Christ's body. Chris observes the cotton poking out of his armrest after the call finishes, just as the TV recording begins to play once more, making Chris prepare to fall asleep. While Jeremy rushes to get Chris, Dean starts the brain transplant process just across the room. He releases the straps, securing Chris to the chair, and prepares an IV. Chris, though, beats him with a lacrosse ball while he's not looking. After glancing at the hung deer on the wall, he has a different thought. Since Jeremy hasn't returned in a while, Dean rushes outside to seek for him. Chris then appears and rams the deer horns into Dean, killing him by bleeding to death. Chris defeats and stabs her in the eye as they battle against one another. Finally reaching the front door, a bloody Jeremy appears and locks him in a headlock as he tries to open the door. Chris succeeds in stabbing the man in the shin. Unaware of what is happening, Rose is upstairs listening to music and browsing black guys without shirts on the internet. Chris unlocks Rose's vehicle and starts it. But as soon as he starts to speed up, he accidentally runs into Georgina. He felt bad for her because his mother had perished in a hit-and-run accident. He leads her inside the vehicle. However, Rose, who heard the crash, hurried outside, brandishing a weapon and calling, "Grandma." At this time, we understand Georgina possesses the grandmother's intellect. Following the collision, Chris stumbles outside the vehicle while dodging Rose's bullet. Walter, the groundskeeper, appears out of nowhere and rushes in his direction, yelling, "Grandpa, get him!" Walter knocks him to the ground. Still, Chris is quick to photograph him with a flash, which suddenly causes the real person within him to become conscious. Walter requests Rose's gun to protect Chris but accidentally shoots her in the stomach. After that, he turns the weapon on him and shoots himself. Then, out of disgust, Chris creeps up to Rose and starts choking her, but he lacks the courage to murder her. Rose calls out for help as a police vehicle suddenly pulls up. Fortunately, it is an airport security vehicle owned by none other than his closest buddy, Rod. Rose bleeds to death in the middle of the street as the two stealthily enter the car and leave.